All right. So, Kushal, thank you so much for joining me for a short conversation about some tips and tricks for searching for a job, which you did not that long ago. So, I'm going to go ahead and get right into it by asking you to introduce yourself with your name and when you graduated from the program and what you're doing now.
Yeah, of course. So glad to be here. My name's Kushal Ismael. I graduated in May 2023. Right now, I'm working at IBM as a senior data science consultant, primarily working with federal government clients.
Terrific. Okay, I have about 5 questions for you. So I'm going to go ahead and start firing them off. First question I have, what is the best networking advice you've received?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the there's two things I think of, and the first one is don't make the interaction transactional. Purely, hey, I'm looking for a job. I need a job. Do you have a job? Right? Don't make that transactional at all. Try to actually make that conversation or whatever the interaction is a little more open-ended, a little more relational. Actually talk to the person. And to that point, second piece of advice is always prepare and practice. So if you are going to speak with somebody and you're networking with them, did you look them up? Do you know what their job title is? Did you look up their company? Did you think of questions you want to actually ask them, right? How did you get from university to where you are now? Or what tools do you use, um, in your current job? Actually having these questions prepared, right, makes it a more interesting conversation for that person. And again, really preparing and practicing that. For me, I know when I speak with people, if they've actually looked me up, looked up my resume, have specific questions, makes me a lot more engaged in that conversation. And again, to that point, it doesn't feel as transactional as, do you have a job for me? It feels like this person wants to get to know me, and now I know them a little bit better. And if I do see a job that comes up, I'm immediately thinking of them, right? Because I have this relationship with that person.
Terrific. Okay, next question. What specific action did you take that you think significantly impacted your job search?
Yeah, so I would say there are two things here as well. The first is tailoring my resume for every single employer or position that I'm applying to. I know it's really easy to create one really nice looking resume and think you can just send that to everybody. But that doesn't always work, right? So, depending on the industry that you're applying to, depending on what specific skills that position that you're applying to is calling out, tailoring my resume to make sure that that is at the top of my resume or that is the first thing in a list so that an employer or wherever it gets to that review process, right? It's finding exactly what it wants. Um, and making sure that all of that's actually in there in my resume and not just a bunch of extra information that someone or whether it's a bot or algorithm is just sorting through. So I'd say that was the first thing. And then the second thing was just following up. If you get to a point where you've submitted a resume and you actually get some sort of human interaction, you have someone you can follow up with, even if you get a rejection email, right? Following up and, saying, why did I get rejected? Do you have any advice for me? You know, taking that extra step. You might not always get a response, but every now and then you do, and that is always really helpful.
And that's something that I'm happy to work with students on because we have some language that they can use to reach out to an employer to say, sorry, this didn't work out, but still interested and would love some feedback. So great advice.
Actually, to that point, sorry, the reason that was so impactful for me was a recruiter had reached out to me, asked me if I was interested in a position at IBM. I said yes. We had a little back and forth, sent my resume, and then they got back to me and said they weren't interested in hiring me anymore. So I followed up and asked, if they had any feedback. And then sure enough, 2 or 3 days later, they said, actually, wait a minute, we are still interested. We have this position. So you never know what can happen by following up.
And it isn't easy.
No, not at all.
Okay, so moving on to interviews. What have you found most helpful in preparing for an interview?
Yeah, when preparing for an interview, so definitely practicing, but also having an understanding of the framework on how to answer interview questions kind of makes the surprise of the question a lot less challenging because you have a framework that you can work within to answer that. And that could be, the STAR situation, task, action, result framework, or maybe it was like CCAR, challenge, context, action, result. I kind of like that framework. So having this framework to answer a question, and then yourself as you're preparing, you're thinking about maybe 3 to 5 different examples, taking those examples and structuring it within that framework so that no matter what question you get asked, probably within those 3 to 5 examples that you have, you can use one. You might need to tailor it a little bit depending on how the question's worded, but you still have that framework to go back to. And even if you think of another example that you didn't prepare at all, using that framework to make it clear and coherent as you're answering these interview questions, ending with that action and result is a takeaway for the person interviewing you versus not having any framework and maybe rambling on zero structure. The person that's interviewing you doesn't know what to take away. But when you have that clear framework, you make it really easy for them to take away those results, those actions, see the way that you might have handled something.
Okay, just to pick up on something that you mentioned, which was practicing. How did you practice?
Um, so I practiced a couple of different ways. First was, I just did, depending on where I was interviewing, I would Google interview questions for this company. So if it's a really big company like IBM, or any of the big consulting firms, they have standard interview questions. I think you'll maybe see like 10 to 20 online, which are a lot, but like the meat of the questions are kind of the same, right? How did you do something? So took some of those questions, wrote out my answers in that framework, practiced aloud, talking, how did that sound to me? Doing that, and then also scheduling a career counseling appointment with a career coach. So actually practicing this, face to face with somebody, and then being able to get that immediate feedback when you're practicing, with your career coach is really helpful because they're the ones who can tell you, hey, I don't know what you were talking about there, or that didn't really make sense, or that was incredible. Do exactly that, and you're going to be great.
I very much appreciate the plug for using career services. Definitely can be helpful in interview prep. And for positions unlike an IBM where there isn't a lot online, one thing somebody could do is go to ChatGPT or its brothers and sisters and ask, for 30 behavioral questions that a data scientist or a business analyst or whatever might get asked. And that's a good place to start with questions too.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great idea.
Some things ChatGPT is really good for, and brainstorming questions is definitely one of them. It's terrific. Okay, on the topic of the capstone, how did you showcase your capstone or any other project or experience to potential employers?
Yeah, so I think just about every project I did within the data science program, I put on my GitHub page. I know in some courses that was part of how we had to submit it, and so that's a really great way to create that online portfolio for my capstone, which you put in a semester's worth of work into. That's another really great project to show, but mine had sensitive data, so I couldn't actually put that on my GitHub page. Um, but I did use it with one employer. When they brought me in for an interview, I had about like a half day interview at their company office. And part of that interview was a 20-minute presentation on a data science project that I had worked on. And so the capstone was perfect because I could fill up 20 minutes talking about that presentation. So I took that, I removed any sensitive data within the presentation part of it, but also tailored the presentation a little bit, right? Like knew where I could add a little more time and where I could sort of remove some stuff that wouldn't be as helpful to them. And so, like I said, it was just like a really great opportunity for me to showcase not just the data science skills that I developed in this program, but showed research skills that I used for this project, as well as my communication and presentation skills. So this employer was or is a consultant. is a consulting firm. And so part of that work is working with clients and talking about the data science work that you're doing. So for them, I knew that presentation piece was really important.
Excellent. The last question I have for you is what specific action have you taken that's been most impactful on your general career advancement? Your biggest piece of
Yeah.
advice.
Yeah. So I would say that networking piece is really, really important. Um, and I know it's a little it's a little scary to do, just because, at times it was reaching out to someone on LinkedIn that I didn't know at all, only had like a minor connection to, or in some instances it was a friend introducing me to somebody else. And it's awkward to have a conversation with a stranger sometimes. And so that's kind of, going back to that piece of preparing and then also not making it transactional, because at the time I was actively looking for a job, right? And so how do I have a conversation with someone and not beg them for a job, but actually try to create a relationship? And so I found networking was huge for me. So even as I was looking for jobs, I reached out to some alum in the data science program, asked them if they were available for, a 10-20 minute chat. I'm interested in applying to a position there and kind of want to hear more about how they got there, or um, what type of work they actually do. Um, and you don't always get yeses, right? People don't always want to meet with you, and that you have to accept that. But people I did meet with were really, really helpful. And so many of them, unprompted would tell me, "Hey, if you're applying to this position, let me know. I'll put in a referral for you, or I'll try to find a hiring manager for you." We're like willing to go out of their way, to help me out, and that I think that is really huge. And it's also helpful to hear about, other employers or things that you're not even thinking about, right? Getting that advice or feedback. So that networking piece can be really, really big.
Okay. I'm going to leave it at that because I think that is terrific advice that all of our students can really benefit from. And I greatly appreciate your time today. I feel like this was also an informational interview. And so, folks, that's how you talk to people. And most of our students are great at talking to people, but it's scary to do it in this context. So I really appreciate your thoughts about networking and all of the other advice that you gave us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.